Admiral Kethvorin stood on the command bridge of the Dominion flagship and looked out at the endless sea of warships that stretched across the void of space like a metal ocean that could swallow entire worlds whole. He had never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. The Valkyrie Dominion had spent 6,000 years conquering the galaxy, and in all that time they had never assembled a fleet this massive or this powerful before today. 12,000 warships hung in formation around him, and each one carried enough firepower to burn a continent down to ash and glass. The legendary World Breaker class dreadnoughts formed the heart of the Armada, and these massive vessels had shattered the crystalline fortresses of the Sinari and boiled the ocean worlds of the Mefkai until nothing remained but steam and death. Kethvorin felt pride swell in his chest as he watched his fleet prepare for what would surely be another easy conquest. The High Council had ordered him to subjugate a new species called humanity, and the intelligence reports told him everything he needed to know about these primitive creatures. They were young and had only been traveling between stars for about 200 years. They were fragile, with soft bodies that could be crushed or burned or broken with the simplest of weapons. They fought among themselves constantly and had already waged 3 civil wars since leaving their homeworld. They were nothing special and certainly nothing that could stand against the might of the Valkyrie Dominion. Kethvorin had conquered 12 species during his long career, and he knew exactly how this encounter would unfold because it always happened the same way. First, the target species would see the size of the fleet and understand that resistance was impossible. Then they would receive the standard terms of surrender and realize that submission was their only option. Finally, they would bow their heads and accept Dominion rule because the alternative was complete extinction. It was a simple formula, and it had worked perfectly for 6,000 years without a single failure. Admiral, his communications officer, called out, "We are approaching the human colony world, designated New Valentia, and we will arrive in standard orbit within the hour." Kethvorin nodded slowly and clasped his 4 hands behind his back as he prepared to deliver the terms of surrender to these insignificant creatures. "Open a channel to the planet below," he commanded, "and let these humans know what awaits them if they choose to resist." The view screen flickered to life, and Kethvorin saw the blue and green world spinning slowly beneath his fleet. It looked peaceful and quiet and completely defenseless against the overwhelming force he had brought to claim it. "Attention, human colony," Kethvorin announced in his most commanding voice. "I am Admiral Kethvorin of the Valkyrie Dominion, and I speak to you now as the instrument of your fate." He paused for effect because he had given this speech many times before, and he knew exactly how to make lesser species tremble with fear. "You have been deemed worthy of joining our great civilization, and you should consider this an honor beyond measure. The Dominion has conquered 47 species across 3 galactic arms, and none have ever escaped our grasp. You will surrender immediately and unconditionally, or you will be destroyed so completely that even the memory of your existence will be erased from the universe. You have 1 hour to respond with your acceptance of these terms." Kethvorin ended the transmission and smiled with satisfaction because he knew the humans would be terrified beyond reason at the sight of his magnificent fleet. He turned to his tactical officer and asked, "How many human ships do our sensors detect in this system?" The tactical officer studied his screens for a moment before answering. "Sir, I am detecting approximately 150 human vessels in orbit around New Valentia." Kethvorin laughed out loud because the number was so pathetically small compared to his own forces. 150 ships against 12,000 was not even a battle, but simply a formality before the inevitable surrender. "They cannot possibly think they can fight us," Kethvorin said to his senior officers, "so we should expect their submission message any moment now." The bridge crew waited in silence as the minutes ticked by, and Kethvorin grew increasingly confident that victory was already assured. Then the communications console beeped, and the officer looked up with confusion written across his scaled face. "Admiral, we are receiving a response from the human command ship." "Excellent," Kethvorin said with satisfaction. "Put it on the main viewer so we can all witness their surrender." The view screen activated and showed a human female sitting calmly in a command chair, surrounded by officers who seemed completely relaxed despite the massive fleet bearing down on them. She had dark hair pulled back tightly, and her eyes were cold and sharp like the edge of a blade ready to cut. "I am Admiral Chen Wei-Lin of the Terran Defense Compact," she said in a voice that carried no fear or hesitation whatsoever. "We have received your terms, and we have considered them very carefully." Kethvorin nodded and waited for the words of submission that he knew would follow. But Admiral Chen did not look like someone about to surrender, and her next words sent a chill down Kethvorin's spine that he had never felt before in his long career. "You should have brought more ships." The transmission ended, and Kethvorin stood frozen in place as his mind struggled to process what he had just heard. Had this human just rejected surrender while facing 12,000 warships with only 150 vessels of her own? Had she actually threatened him when her entire species stood on the edge of annihilation? "Sir," the tactical officer said with sudden alarm in his voice, "I am detecting massive energy signatures emerging from behind the planet's moon." Kethvorin turned to look at the tactical display and watched as dozens of new contacts appeared on the screen. These were not the small patrol ships they had detected earlier, but something much larger and much more dangerous. "What are those vessels?" Kethvorin demanded. "And why did our long-range sensors not detect them before now?" The tactical officer's hands trembled as he studied the readings, and his voice cracked when he finally answered. "Admiral, these ships are bigger than all world breakers, and they are powering weapons that our sensors cannot even identify." "That is impossible," Kethvorin snarled, "because the Dominion has the most advanced warships in the galaxy, and no primitive species could possibly have technology superior to ours." But the evidence on his tactical display said otherwise, and Kethvorin felt the first seeds of doubt begin to grow in his mind. He had brought the greatest fleet in Dominion history to crush these humans, and yet they did not seem afraid at all. They seemed almost eager for the battle to begin, and that realization filled Kethvorin with a cold dread that he could not explain. What did these humans know that he did not? What secrets were they hiding behind that small blue world? And why did Admiral Chen's eyes hold the look of a predator that had just spotted its prey? The answers to these questions would come soon enough, and Kethvorin would learn that some species were not meant to be conquered. Some species were born to fight, and humanity was about to teach the Velkari Dominion a lesson they would never forget. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin sat in her command chair aboard the TDC, Terra's Wrath, and studied the tactical display with the calm focus of someone who had been preparing for this exact moment her entire life. She had known they would come eventually, because the galaxy was vast and full of species that saw conquest as their divine right. The Intelligence Division had been tracking the Velkari Dominion for decades, and they had learned everything they could about these alien conquerors. The Dominion had crushed 47 different civilizations, and not a single one had ever managed to defeat them in battle. They believed themselves invincible, and that belief would be their greatest weakness. "Admiral," her tactical officer, Lieutenant Commander James Okonkwo, reported, "the Velkari fleet has entered weapons range, and they appear to be holding formation." Chen nodded slowly and allowed herself a small smile that did not reach her cold, sharp eyes. "They are waiting for us to surrender," she said, "because that is what every other species has done when facing their mighty armada." "Should we be concerned about those numbers?" Captain Yuki Tanaka asked from her position at the secondary command station. Tanaka commanded the battleship TDC, Thermopylae, and she had transferred to the flagship for the tactical coordination meeting. Chun shook her head and pulled up a historical file on her personal display. Let me tell you something about humanity that these Valkyrie do not understand, Chun said to her senior officers. They looked at us and saw a young species that has only been among the stars for 2 centuries. They saw our short lifespans and our fragile bodies and our history of internal conflict. They saw all of these things and concluded that we would be easy prey. Chun stood up from her chair and walked to the main viewport where she could see the distant lights of the enemy fleet like a swarm of angry stars. What they failed to understand is the context behind everything they observed. We did not spend 2 centuries peacefully expanding across the galaxy like naive children exploring a garden. We spent those centuries fighting and bleeding and dying for every single world we claimed. She turned back to face her officers, and her voice grew harder with each word. 3 interstellar civil wars taught us how to wage campaigns across light years of space. 2 separate incursions from the Sketh Hives taught us that the universe wants us dead and will send monsters to kill us. Every colony we built was designed as a fortress because we learned that peace is an illusion that shatters the moment you stop being strong. Lieutenant Commander Okonkwo nodded with understanding because he had grown up on the frontier world of New Johannesburg, where children learn to shoot before they learn to read. The Valkyrie think war is something they do to other species. Chun continued, but for humanity war is simply how we have always survived. Our ancestors fought predators with sharpened sticks and refused to die. Our ancestors fought plagues that killed millions and refused to die. Our ancestors fought each other in conflicts that burned entire continents and still refused to die. We are the descendants of everyone who was too stubborn or too angry or too determined to surrender to anything the universe threw at them. Captain Tanaka smiled grimly because she knew exactly what Chun was describing. Her own grandmother had survived the Battle of Proxima, stationed during the Second Civil War, and had personally led a counterattack that retook the station deck by deck with nothing but hand weapons and fury. So what is our plan? Tanaka asked, because I assume we are not simply going to charge at 12,000 enemy ships and hope for the best. Chun returned to her command chair and activated the tactical display. The 3rd and 7th defense groups will engage first with approximately 800 ships total. That should be enough to test their capabilities and identify any weaknesses we can exploit. Okonkwo looked at the display and then back at Chun with confusion on his face. Admiral, if we are only deploying 2 defense groups, then what about the rest of our forces? Chun's smile grew wider, and there was something almost predatory in her expression. The Valkyrie brought what they considered to be their greatest fleet ever assembled. I want them to think they are facing our greatest fleet as well. When the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 9th defense groups arrive, I want the Valkyrie to understand just how badly they have miscalculated. The bridge fell silent as the officers absorbed the implications of what their admiral was planning. The Valkyrie had brought 12,000 ships and thought they had overwhelming force. But humanity had been preparing for alien invasion since the first contact with the Sketh Hives over a century ago. The Defense Compact had built shipyards hidden inside gas giants where no sensors could find them. They had constructed weapons platforms inside asteroid fields that looked like natural debris. They had developed technologies that they had never revealed to anyone because secrecy was the ultimate strategic advantage. The Hammerfall-class battleships that were emerging from behind New Valencia's moon were just the beginning. These massive vessels had been built specifically to fight enemies like the Valkyrie, and each one carried enough firepower to crack a small moon in half. Admiral, the communications officer reported, the Valkyrie are broadcasting standard intimidation messages and demanding our immediate surrender. Chum laughed softly and shook her head at the arrogance of these alien conquerors. They still think this is going to be easy, she said. So let us show them how wrong they are. Send my response and make sure every ship in their fleet can hear it. The communications officer nodded and opened a channel to the enemy armada. Chun stood tall and spoke in a voice that carried across the void of space. "You should have brought more ships." She cut the transmission and turned to her tactical officer. "Begin deployment of the autonomous kill platforms and activate all stealth systems. Tell Captain Rodriguez to bring his frigate wing around the dark side of the moon and wait for my signal. Inform the Thermopylae that they have the honor of firing the first shot." Captain Tanaka saluted and headed for the shuttle bay to return to her ship. She was eager to test the new plasma lance batteries that had been installed during the last refit. Admiral Chun watched her go and then turned her attention back to the tactical display. The Valkyrie fleet was advancing in their traditional conquest formation, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. They saw 150 patrol ships and assumed that was the extent of human resistance. They did not see the thousands of automated weapons platforms drifting silently in the darkness. They did not see the massive battleships powering up weapons that could punch through any shield ever created. They did not see the reinforcements that were already en route and would arrive at the perfect moment to crush any hope of victory. The Valkyrie Dominion had conquered 47 species because none of them had been ready to fight back. But humanity had been born fighting, and they had never stopped. Today, the Dominion would learn what happened when they picked a fight with a species that treated war as a heritage, passed down through countless generations. Today, they would learn that some prey had teeth, and those teeth were about to bite very hard indeed. The Battle of New Valentia began with silence and ended with fire that burned across the void of space, like the wrath of an angry god. Admiral Kethvorin had ordered his vanguard frigates to advance first because that was standard Dominion doctrine. The lighter ships would probe the enemy defenses and identify any threats before the heavier vessels moved in to deliver the killing blow. It was a tactic that had worked flawlessly against 47 different species, and Kethvorin had no reason to believe it would fail today. 300 frigates surged forward in perfect formation, and their captains were eager to prove themselves against these primitive humans. They never got the chance. The first frigate simply vanished from the tactical display without any warning whatsoever. One moment it was there, and the next moment it was nothing but expanding debris and frozen bodies tumbling through the darkness. Kethvorin blinked in confusion because he had not seen enemy weapons fire. Then a second frigate exploded, and a third and a fourth. "What is happening?" Kethvorin roared at his tactical officer. "Where is that fire coming from?" The tactical officer's hands flew across his console as he desperately tried to identify the source of the attacks. "Sir, I cannot detect any enemy vessels in that sector, but something is definitely shooting at our ships." Kethvorin watched in horror as more and more of his frigates were torn apart by invisible weapons. The human admiral had seeded the entire approach corridor with thousands of automated kill platforms. These small devices drifted through space like debris, and their stealth systems made them nearly impossible to detect. But when an enemy ship came within range, they activated with deadly precision and fired concentrated energy beams that could cut through frigate armor like a blade through soft flesh. "Pull back the vanguard," Kethvorin commanded, "and bring the world breakers forward. If these humans want to play games with hidden weapons, then we will simply burn everything in our path." The massive dreadnoughts moved to the front of the formation, and their shields flickered to full power. Each world breaker carried enough armor and shielding to withstand planetary bombardment, and their weapons could crack the crust of a moon. Surely these primitive human tricks would be useless against such overwhelming firepower. The dreadnoughts began sweeping the space ahead with their secondary weapons, and the hidden kill platforms started exploding as they were detected and destroyed. Kethvorin smiled grimly because the tide of battle was already turning back in his favor. "Now we shall see how these humans fight when they cannot hide in the shadows," he said with renewed confidence. Then the human Hammerfall-class battleships emerged from behind New Valencia's moon, and everything changed. Kethvorin had never seen vessels so massive or so heavily armed in his entire career. Each human battleship was nearly twice the size of a world-breaker, and their hulls bristled with weapons that made the Admiral's blood run cold. "Impossible," Kethvorin whispered. "How could these primitives build ships like that?" The answer came in the form of a blinding beam of plasma that lanced across the void and struck the lead world-breaker directly in the bow. The shot came from the TDC Thermopylae, and Captain Yuki Tanaka had personally aimed the plasma lance at the biggest target she could find. The world-breaker's shields flared brilliant white as they tried to absorb the incredible energy. For a moment it seemed like the shields might hold, and Kethvorin felt a surge of hope. Then the shields collapsed, and the plasma beam punched through the dreadnought's armor like it was made of paper. The world-breaker broke apart in a spectacular explosion that consumed two nearby cruisers and sent shockwaves rippling across the Dominion formation. Kethvorin stood frozen in absolute shock, because no weapon in the galaxy should have been able to do that. The world-breakers were supposed to be invincible. They had never lost a single ship in 6,000 years of conquest. And now one had been destroyed by a single shot from a species that the Dominion had dismissed as primitive and insignificant. "All ships," Kethvorin screamed into the fleet-wide communication channel, "concentrate fire on those human battleships. Destroy them before they can fire again." Thousands of Velkari weapons opened fire simultaneously, and the void of space became a hellstorm of energy beams and missiles and plasma bolts. The human battleships took the punishment, and their shields glowed white-hot under the sustained assault. But they did not break, and they did not flee. Instead, they fired back with weapons that tore through Dominion ships like a farmer harvesting wheat. The TDC Terra's wrath unleashed a broadside that destroyed 4 cruisers in a single devastating volley. The TDC Stalingrad plowed directly into a formation of Dominion destroyers and crushed them with sheer mass before finishing them off with close-range plasma fire. The TDC Leonas took position above a world-breaker and pounded it with missiles until the dreadnought's reactor went critical and vaporized everything within 100 kilometers. Kethvorin watched his fleet dying, and he could not understand how this was happening. He had brought 12,000 ships to crush these humans. He had the numbers and the experience and the finest warriors in the Dominion. But the humans fought like demons possessed by pure rage, and they seemed to have no fear of death whatsoever. Every time a human ship was damaged, it simply pulled back, made repairs, and returned to the fight. Every time a Dominion ship was damaged, it became a target for 3 more human vessels that swarmed in for the kill. The battle was not going according to any plan or doctrine that Kethvorin had ever studied. The humans were not fighting to defend their colony. They were hunting his fleet like predators running down wounded prey. "Admiral," his tactical officer reported with despair in his voice, "we have lost over 2,000 ships in the first hour of combat. Our shields cannot withstand their plasma weapons, and our armor cannot stop their missiles. We need to retreat, or we will lose everything." Kethvorin's pride would not allow him to consider retreat. No Velkari admiral had ever fled from battle in 6,000 years, and he would not be the first. "We still have numbers on our side," he snarled. "So we will press the attack and overwhelm them through sheer weight of fire. Order all remaining dreadnoughts to concentrate on the human flagship. If we destroy their admiral, then perhaps their fleet will lose coordination." The surviving world-breakers turned their massive weapons toward the TDC Terras wrath and began pouring fire into the human command ship. Admiral Chun's flagship shuddered under the assault, and alarms began wailing across every deck. But Chun did not flinch, and she did not retreat. "Maintain position," she ordered calmly, "and give the Thermopylae time to flank those dreadnoughts." We can take the punishment they are dishing out." Her crew obeyed without hesitation because they trusted their admiral completely. They knew that Chun had a plan, and they knew that humanity did not lose battles against alien invaders. The war had only just begun, and the Volcari Dominion had not yet seen what humanity was truly capable of. The worst was still to come, and Admiral Cathvorin would soon learn that his greatest fleet was nothing more than a warm-up for the species that had conquered death itself. The TDC Terra's Wrath was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. Admiral Chun stood on her burning bridge and watched as damage reports flooded in from every section of the ship. The concentrated fire from 7 world breakers had finally overwhelmed the flagship's shields, and plasma was eating through the hull like acid. 3 of her main weapons batteries had been destroyed, and the port engine was completely gone. Bodies of her crew lay scattered across the deck, and the survivors worked desperately to keep the ship fighting. "Admiral," her helmsman shouted over the screaming alarms, "we have lost maneuvering capability, and reactor containment is failing. We need to abandon ship immediately." Chun nodded grimly and activated the fleet-wide communication channel. "All hands, this is Admiral Chun ordering immediate evacuation of the Terra's Wrath. Transfer command authority to the TDC Thermopylae and continue the battle. Do not let these alien bastards think they have won anything today." Escape pods began launching from the dying flagship, and Chun supervised the evacuation with calm efficiency. She made sure every surviving crew member reached the pods before she would even consider leaving herself. That was when Captain Yuki Tanaka's voice crackled over the communication system. "Admiral Chun, the Thermopylae is moving to cover your evacuation, but we are taking heavy fire. Those world breakers are trying to destroy your escape pods." Chun felt cold fury rise in her chest because the Volcari were not content with destroying her ship. They wanted to murder her helpless crew as they fled. That was when she made a decision that would become legendary throughout human space. "Captain Tanaka," Chun said with steel in her voice, "I am transferring command to you effective immediately. But I need you to pull back the Thermopylae and give me room to work." "What are you planning?" Tanaka demanded, "because I do not like the sound of that." Chun smiled grimly and turned to the 3 crew members who had refused to leave her side. "I am going to show these Volcari what happens when they try to kill my people. Now, get to your escape pods because I can fly this wreck by myself." Her remaining crew looked at each other and then back at their admiral with expressions of absolute devotion. "With respect, Admiral," her chief engineer said, "we are staying right here. You are going to need someone to keep the reactor from blowing up too soon." Chen wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in their eyes. These were her people, and they would not abandon her any more than she would abandon them. "Then let us give these alien conquerors something to remember," Chun said, and set course directly for the heart of their formation. The crippled Terra's Wrath began moving forward on its remaining engine, and the Volcari ship scattered in confusion. They had expected the human flagship to flee or surrender. They had not expected it to charge directly at them like a wounded predator making one final attack. Admiral Cathvorin watched the approaching human ship with growing alarm. "What is she doing?" he demanded of his tactical officer. "That ship is crippled and she cannot possibly hope to accomplish anything by attacking." The tactical officer studied his readings, and his face went pale with sudden understanding. "Sir, the human flagship is overloading its antimatter reactor cores. If she reaches our formation before containment fails, then the explosion will destroy everything within weapons range." Cathvorin felt genuine fear for the first time in his long career. These humans were insane. They would rather die than accept defeat, and they would take as many enemies with them as possible. "All ships," Cathvorin screamed. "Destroy that vessel before it reaches us." Every weapon in the Dominion fleet turned toward the charging Terra's Wrath. Beams of energy and waves of missiles slammed into the human ship, and tore it apart piece by piece. But the flagship kept coming because Admiral Chun was not going to stop until she had accomplished her mission. The Terra's wrath exploded at the exact moment Chun had planned. The antimatter detonation consumed 19 Valkyrie warships instantly and damaged dozens more. Admiral Chun and her loyal crew were vaporized in the blast, but they had died as warriors. They had died fighting, and they had taken their enemies with them. Captain Tanaka watched the explosion from the bridge of the Thermopylae and felt tears streaming down her face. Admiral Chun had been her mentor and her friend, and now she was gone. But there was no time to mourn because the battle was still raging and Tanaka was now in command. All ships, Tanaka announced with fury burning in her voice. This is Captain Tanaka, assuming fleet command. Admiral Chun just showed us how humans face death. Now let us show these Valkyrie how humans deal with the enemies who killed our admiral. The human fleet surged forward with renewed fury, and the Valkyrie ships began falling back in disarray. Kethvorn could not believe what he was witnessing. He had just killed the enemy admiral and destroyed their flagship. Any other species would have lost morale and started retreating. But these humans were fighting harder than ever, and their ships were cutting through his fleet like blades through soft fruit. Then the tactical officer made an announcement that shattered whatever hope Kethvorn still held. Admiral, multiple FTL signatures detected at the system's edge. Hundreds of contacts emerging from faster-than-light travel. Kethvorn felt his heart sink as he watched the tactical display update with wave after wave of new human ships. The first defense group arrived with 800 warships. The second defense group followed with 700 more. The fourth and ninth defense groups emerged moments later with another 1,000 vessels combined. 3,000 human warships now filled the system, and they were all heading directly for the Valkyrie fleet. Kethvorn finally understood the terrible truth that Admiral Chun had known from the beginning. The humans had not deployed their full strength against his invasion. They had sent a small patrol force to test the Dominion's capabilities. The 800 ships he had been fighting were not the human fleet. They were merely the warm-up. "Sir," his tactical officer said with defeat in his voice, "enemy reinforcements have cut off our retreat vector. We are surrounded." Kethvorn looked at the tactical display and saw the truth of his situation. His mighty fleet of 12,000 ships had been reduced to less than 6,000. The humans now outnumbered him, and their ships were clearly superior in every measurable way. There was only one option left. All ships, Kethvorn ordered with shame burning in his chest. Emergency retreat to any available exit vector. We must escape and warn the Dominion about what we have encountered. The surviving Valkyrie vessels turned and fled as fast as their engines could carry them. The humans pursued and continued destroying ships until the Dominion fleet finally escaped into faster-than-light travel. Less than 2,000 Valkyrie ships survived the Battle of New Valencia. They had brought their greatest fleet and lost over 10,000 warships. They had called humanity primitive and paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. Captain Tanaka watched the enemy retreat and allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. The Valkyrie Dominion had learned a lesson today that they would never forget. Humanity was not prey to be hunted. Humanity was the hunter, and the galaxy would soon understand what that truly meant. The news of the Battle of New Valencia spread across the galaxy like wildfire, and every species that heard it struggled to believe what had happened. The Valkyrie Dominion had been the most feared power in known space for 6,000 years. They had conquered 47 different civilizations and crushed every military force that had ever opposed them. And now they had been broken by a young species that most galactic powers had never even heard of before. The Galactic Concord held an emergency session to discuss the implications of this stunning defeat. Ambassadors from dozens of species crowded into the Great Assembly Hall and spoke in hushed voices. about the humans who had done the impossible. The Zanari representative, whose people had been conquered 500 years ago, could barely contain her emotions. "Is it true?" she asked the assembly. "Did these humans really destroy the Dominion's greatest fleet?" The Methkai ambassador nodded slowly and displayed holographic recordings that had been transmitted from the battlefield. "Our intelligence networks have confirmed everything," he said, "and the footage speaks for itself." The assembly watched in stunned silence as the Battle of New Valentia played out before their eyes. They saw the Velkari fleet arrive with its 12,000 warships, and they saw the confident advance of the Worldbreaker dreadnoughts. They saw the hidden kill platforms tear through the vanguard, and the massive human battleships emerge from behind the moon. They saw Admiral Chun's sacrifice and the devastating explosion that consumed 19 enemy ships. And they saw the arrival of the human reinforcements that turned the battle into a complete rout. When the recording ended, the assembly hall erupted in chaos. Some representatives cheered and celebrated because they saw this as the beginning of the end for their Dominion oppressors. Others expressed fear and concern because a species that could defeat the Velkari might become an even greater threat. Then the doors of the assembly hall opened and a delegation of humans walked in. Every eye in the chamber turned to look at these strange beings who had changed the balance of galactic power overnight. The human delegation was led by Ambassador Sarah Okafor, and she walked with quiet confidence toward the central podium. She was not tall or physically imposing, but there was something about her presence that commanded attention. "Distinguished representatives of the Galactic Concord," she began, "I am Ambassador Okafor of the Terran Defense Compact. I come to you today not as a conqueror seeking tribute, but as a neighbor offering friendship." The assembly fell silent as they waited to hear what this human would say. Ambassador Okafor continued with a voice that carried warmth and sincerity. "Humanity did not seek this war with the Velkari Dominion. They came to our space and demanded our surrender, and we simply refused to comply. We defended our people and our homes as any species would do when threatened with extinction." The Zanari representative raised her hand and asked the question that everyone wanted answered. "Why should we trust you when you have demonstrated the power to crush anyone who opposes you? What guarantee do we have that humanity will not become the next great conqueror?" Ambassador Okafor smiled gently, and her response surprised everyone in the chamber. "You have no guarantee at all," she admitted, "because we cannot prove our intentions with words alone. But I can tell you what humanity wants, and you can judge for yourselves whether we are worthy of trust." She activated a holographic display that showed a map of human space with all of its colonies and stations. "We want to trade with other species and learn from your cultures and share the knowledge we have gained. We want to explore the galaxy and discover the wonders that lie beyond our small corner of the cosmos. We want to build relationships with neighbors who will treat us with respect and dignity. And most importantly, we want to help those who have suffered under the yoke of Dominion oppression." The chamber buzzed with whispered conversations as the representatives discussed what they had just heard. Could these humans truly be offering liberation instead of conquest? Could they really be as different from the Velkari as they claimed to be? The Methkai ambassador stood and addressed the human delegation directly. "My people were conquered by the Dominion 3,000 years ago," he said, "and we have dreamed of freedom ever since. If humanity is truly willing to help us, then we would welcome your alliance with open hearts." Ambassador Okafor nodded, and her expression became serious. "The Terran Defense Compact is prepared to offer military assistance to any species seeking to free themselves from Dominion control. We will provide weapons and training, and if necessary, we will send our own ships to fight alongside yours. The Velkari have spent 6,000 years teaching the galaxy that might makes right. Humanity intends to teach a different lesson. We believe that the strong should protect the weak, and that freedom is a right that belongs to every sentient being." The assembly hall erupted in applause as dozens of species rose to show their support for the human proposal. For the first time in thousands of years, there was hope that the Dominion's reign of terror might finally come to an end. Meanwhile, on the Dominion homeworld, the mood was very different. Admiral Kethvorn knelt before the High Council and recounted the disaster at New Valentia. The council members listened in grim silence as he described the human weapons and tactics that had destroyed their fleet. When he finished speaking, the eldest member of the council rose to address the assembly. "We have made ourselves the enemy of a species that treats annihilation as a challenge," he said. "There is no strategy for defeating such an opponent. There is only survival and hoping they find us unworthy of their attention." Kethvorn bowed his head in shame because he knew the elder spoke the truth. The Dominion had awakened something terrible, and now they would have to live with the consequences. Back on New Valentia, the Defense Compact held a memorial service for the fallen. Captain Tanaka stood before the assembled fleet and spoke words of honor for Admiral Chun and all who had died in the battle. These brave souls gave their lives so that humanity could remain free. They faced an enemy that had never known defeat, and they showed the galaxy what we are made of. Admiral Chun once told me that war is not something humans do, but something we are. Today we proved her right, and tomorrow we will prove it again. The gathered crews raised their voices in a chant that echoed across the void of space. For Earth and all her children. For those who came before. For those who will come after. We will never surrender. And across the galaxy, species that had lived in fear for thousands of years heard about the Battle of New Valentia and began to dream of freedom. They whispered to each other about the humans who had crushed the Dominion's greatest fleet. They spoke of Admiral Chun's sacrifice and Captain Tanaka's fury. They wondered what would happen next now that humanity had announced itself to the galaxy. The answer would come soon enough, because humanity was not content with a single victory. They had spent their entire existence fighting for survival, and they had no intention of stopping now. The Valkyrie Dominion had called their invasion fleet the greatest armada ever assembled. But humanity had called it something very different. They had called it a warm-up. And the galaxy held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when humanity faced a real threat.